So we're gonna just get started with some of the basics, right? So this, we were calling this a Civics 101 session. As we go through this session, you're gonna get a lot of information that's unique to our current time and what's happening with our executive branch during our current moment. But we can't go all the way into that without first starting with some of the basics, some of the foundational information about this branch of government and about how it functions, and also about the state versus the federal. So if you're looking at this Venn diagram that we have set up, you can see that the state, for example, is established for providing public safety, whereas the federal government can coin money and regulate currency. The federal government can also do things with war and raising and maintaining the Navy. The federal government also regulates interstate commerce. So if you think about the federal government as really having to do with all the things that are occurring across all of our states and setting those guidelines and principles for the entire nation, that's kind of where the federal government comes in. And it is the supreme law of the land. So while we have local ordinances that come out of our cities and we have state laws, right, none of those can contradict federal law. Federal law is our supreme law. When we're looking at state powers, you know, I have it characterized here as kind of like the path to local government, because states establish our local governments and have a lot of work that happens between the state government and our local government. It assumes powers that the federal government does not have delegated to it, and honors other states' public acts. Now, things that our federal government and our state governments have in common include levying, collecting taxes, being able to borrow money, chartering corporations. When we talk about chartering corporations, we're talking about organizations that sometimes take on public services within a state or within a municipality. And then finally, we have responding to emergencies, which of course we're gonna get into as we move a little further into our content. So those are kind of like, there are these two levels of government, and then the local level of government is another level that, you know, if we could add a third circle here, we could talk about the things that are in common. We're gonna focus a little bit on kind of federal and state for today. So just quick refresher on the three branches of government. You know, and these branches of government exist at the federal level, they exist at the state level, they exist at the local level. You've got your legislative branch, which writes laws, right? You've got your executive branch, which leads government administration and implements laws. And you've got your judicial branch, which interprets laws and administers justice. So at the federal level, we know these branches as Congress, you know, the United States House of Representatives, the United States Senate, US House, US Senate. We know the president hires department leaders, all of whom are within that executive branch of government, and the Supreme Court. You know, there are other federal courts, but the Supreme Court is the highest court. At the state level, when we think about these branches, and these are logos on the slide if you're looking at it. So at the federal level, each of these branches has its own seal. At the state level, our Michigan House and Michigan Senate don't have a seal, so we just have a little symbol there for it. By the state level, we know the State House of Representatives, the State Senate. Our executive branch is the governor's office, again, hiring those department heads, administering those services. And then we also have a Michigan Supreme Court. And again, there are many lower courts that are all part of the court system in our state. A big thing about branches of government is that they all have checks and balances on their powers, so that no one branch is all powerful, right? So when we talk about later about kind of responding to emergencies, and when you are discussing with your friends, your family about kind of government powers, that's where this conversation about checks and balances comes in, and how they are implemented in different circumstances. Looking at the executive branch specifically, so today we'll be discussing the role of the executive of the state, which is the governor's office, and the powers of that office, particularly during an emergency or a disaster. And we kept both of the president's seal up and the governor's seal up because again, we just want to continue to remind you that even if in civics class you learn the branches of government at the federal level, the executive branch exists within the state as well. So why do we need to know where the governor's powers come from? The governor leads the state and its department. He, she, they work with the legislature to use laws to serve citizens and manage the budget to fund those services. So where those how those powers are implemented are very important in our everyday lives. Our legislature is writing laws and is developing budgets and things like that, but how it actually gets put into practice is through this executive office and the departments that are underneath it. So when we think about emergency powers of the governor, like there are moments, emergencies and disasters are actually legally defined terms. So when we start talking about our government and how it functions, sometimes there are words that we use in our daily language that have legal terms in these circumstances and for the work of these individuals. So in this case, emergencies and disasters legally can offer opportunities where the governor's power may expand to protect the welfare of the state. And again, that's language that's very intentionally used and has legal implications. So COVID-19 as a pandemic is an example of when those emergency powers can come into place, when we have seen them come into place, and it all has to do with protecting the residents of the state, which is part of the job of the executive. So to quickly do just like, since we're gonna focus on disasters, we're gonna focus on COVID-19, just wanted to give you a quick refresher on kind of the timeline that we've been looking at in our state and how it's connected to kind of government action. So we think July 31st, 2020, the United States Department of Health and Human Services declared a public health emergency. So that's coming from the federal level, right? Something that comes from the federal level in that way automatically gives states the opportunities and state executives the opportunities to operate within their state to protect the welfare of their citizens. February 28th, 2020, the Governor Whitmer activates a state emergency. Again, we're talking about these legal terms and we're gonna dive into them a little further shortly. March 3rd, task force are created. These task forces are taking on some of the administrative work and looking at how services are delivered under this time, under these circumstances, and what it will look like over time. March 10th, 2020, the first 2 presumptive positive cases of COVID-19 are identified in Michigan. That same day, Governor Whitmer declares a state of emergency via Executive Order 2024. When you are looking at executive orders, you're looking at the year that they were implemented and then the number. So this was the 4th executive order of 2020. March 28th, 2020, at the request of Governor Whitmer, President Donald Trump declares a major disaster exists in Michigan. Again, these are declarations that come with legal implications and that also have implications for how power can be used. April 28th, 2020, Governor Whitmer extends the state of emergency. So when we talk about states of emergency as, again, these declarations as these legal documents, they have dates on them, and the extension of the dates or when the date starts or stops then that impacts when and how certain work can be done. And then May 20th, some areas of the state have begun to open with restrictions. So if you've been following along and even this past weekend, I'm sure you have seen there's some places open. Things are happening differently up north than they are down here in Southeast Michigan. But this is, again, just a little quick kind of refresher on the timeline. So you kind of have a sense of how things have gone, where they're going, and as we get into the details, you can see where these different actions play in. So declaring an emergency. At any point, whether there's an emergency or not, the governor is able to issue executive orders. So when we talk about declaring an emergency, a lot of what happens there, it's operating through the executive order and connected to certain state laws. So the limitations on executive orders are that they may not violate the law or impede on the powers of other government branches. So they can expand power, but they can't, for example, stop the legislature from writing laws. Like that is the power of the legislature. An executive order can't contradict that. And an executive order, again, is one way that emergency can be declared for the state and requesting federal disaster declaration is the other. So when we look at one side of how the governor can declare an emergency for the state, you've got our state and local emergency declaration, and there are two state laws that are connected to that, Public Act 302, which is the emergency powers of the governor, and Public Act 390, the Emergency Management Act. Which of course, for us in Detroit, when we hear Emergency Management Act, we think about it in one very specific way. But when we talk about it here, when we talk about it in terms of emergency powers and responding to a disaster, it takes on a whole different meaning or a whole different route of use. And so then the other connection to the governor in declaring an emergency is a federal declaration. So the governor can request a federal declaration from the president, and then that declaration from the president, if the president approves it or responds favorably, right, then that has some other connections to what happens next. So starting with executive orders a bit, an executive order may be a general policy statement written to persuade, or it can be a specific directive. And it's important to know that these powers have been in place for almost 60 years, and they are constitutional powers to create executive orders. You'll note that, the mayor can also have executive orders. The president can have executive orders. Like, this is a established tool across levels of government. And so sometimes, again, they are written to try and persuade, but other times they can do direct action, such as reorganizing agencies within the executive branch, reassigning functions among executive branch agencies. When we say reassigning functions, it means, maybe a job that, Health and Human Services was doing will move to another department. When we talk about reorganizing agencies, for example, under Governor Snyder's administration, there used to be a department or a Department of Older Adult Services, and then through a reorganization that was absorbed into the Department of Health and Human Services. Executive orders may also create temporary agencies. They can establish an advisory body, a commission, or task force. They can reduce expenditures authorized by appropriations. So not increase, but can reduce. And they can proclaim or end an emergency, which is of course where we're spending our time today. So when we talk about proclaiming an emergency and this executive order 2020-4, since March 10th, the governor has issued and amended more than 70 executive orders that include special pandemic precautions in correctional facilities, closing of non-essential businesses, amending the eligibility for unemployment, allowing no eviction of renters, and the ability to conduct remote public meetings. And that's just to name a few. So these orders were all issued to accomplish the governor's policies to protect Michigan citizens in responding to this declaration of emergency, this pandemic that we're facing. The governor also created 4 task forces comprising key state government agencies to coordinate the state's response and work closely with the appropriate community and non-governmental stakeholders. So there's a task force on state operations, which includes employment and facilities. There's a task force on health and human services. We talk about providing medical services, human services, protecting healthcare workers. There's a task force on education. So What will be the educational guidelines for K-12 schools, opening and closing, and this also covers our public universities and colleges. There's a task force on the economy and workforce, covering general economic impact, the workforce supply chain, business continuity, and issues of that nature. So you have to think about it, again, within the context of an emergency. So even, if you get into a car accident, right? Like now is not the time that your typical car maintenance procedures are coming into play, right? When you have that emergency, when you have that moment, you have to reorganize and address it as best you can facing it. So government is kind of similar. We have set protocols, set procedures, set departments that are doing the work every single day. But when emergency hits and when things are changing very, very quickly, sometimes our government leaders establish task forces so that they can respond in a more meaningful and direct way when facing an emergency. So in addition to the executive orders, so the executive orders kind of like set the playing field, right? And then as we focus a little bit on the state level emergency powers, we're looking again at these two legislative public acts. So we're gonna start with Public Act 302, which is emergency powers of the governor. So during a disaster, this act may be implemented. The emergency powers are limited to times of great public crisis, disaster, rioting, catastrophe, or similar public emergency within the state, or reasonable apprehension of immediate danger of a public emergency of that kind when public safety is imperiled. So I read that directly as it is written in the law. And when we think about times of great public crisis, a pandemic, COVID-19 fits within that definition. And therefore, within this law, the executive orders declaring a state of emergency and the emergency powers that we're going to look at here, now the governor is able to utilize. So for the period of a state of emergency, the governor may control traffic, establish a curfew, regulate and prohibit the use and occupancy of buildings and public places, and control the sale and transportation of alcohol, dangerous liquids, or explosives. And when we talk about the period of a state of emergency, there is a start and stop date on our executive orders, and we talk about expansions or extending those dates. That's why the period is so important, because these powers exist within that period. And connected to this law, anyone who violates the governor's orders is guilty of a misdemeanor, which can appear harsh, but it restricts the governor from enforcing more severe penalties, such as felonies, for violating these rules. So on one hand, it's harsh, but on the other hand, the law does have restrictions on how grave of a penalty can be enforced. So the other public act that we're going to look at is Public Act 390, the Emergency Management Act. And again, we in Detroit have experienced this in, some very significant ways that are different from the circumstances of COVID-19. So we just want to focus a little bit, we want to focus a lot on what we're talking about when we say the Emergency Management Act in this context. So Public Act 390 of 1976, the Emergency Management Act, includes issuing orders that have the same effect as law during an emergency situation. So if there is an emergency, there's now the opportunity to issue orders that have the same effect as law. The governor may declare a state of disaster or a state of emergency, in quotes, because these are legal terms. A disaster is an occurrence or threat of widespread or severe damage, injury, or loss of life or property resulting from a natural or human-made cause. Epidemics are named as such a disaster in this law. So again, we talk about great loss of life, and we talk about the impact that COVID-19 has had on our communities. I think that it's pretty clear how a state of disaster, a state of emergency applies to this current moment. During a state of emergency, the state assists local governments, quote, to save lives, protect property and the public health and safety, or to lessen or avert the threat of a catastrophe in any particular part of the state. Now, within this law, an emergency may last only 28 days, but an extension can be requested from the legislature for a specific period of time. And there's not a restriction on how many extensions are requested from the legislature, just that they are time bound, and that after that initial 28 days, you do have to continue requesting those extensions. So if you've been following the news and if you've heard about those extensions, this is and about the legislature and the relationship and the work between the governor's office and the legislature, this is part of what's going on there. So when we talk about powers from this law, you can suspend regulatory rules, spend state resources, reorganize state departments, force evacuations, control movements in and around certain areas, and limit the sale of alcohol. So you can see how the two public acts and the powers that they offer connect and dovetail for the governor to do her work during this moment. So in terms of like how this actually looks in practice, non-essential businesses being closed, gatherings being prevented, closing schools, the stay-at-home policy, you can see that happening in practice. You can see this list of items happening in practice in those areas. So those are our state laws. When we look at the federal declaration, this is a different process that happens and that connects with how our levels of government interact with one another. Sometimes it can feel like we're just in the state on our own or just in the city on our own, but at all times our levels of government are interacting with one another and impact what resources that we have access to, and how laws can be implemented and things like that. So when we look at the federal declaration, President Donald Trump declared a major disaster existed in Michigan March 28th. He made similar declarations for other states as they're trying to respond to this crisis. An emergency declaration can be declared for any occasion or instance when the president determines federal assistance is needed. An emergency declaration supplement state and local efforts in providing emergency services, such as the protection of lives, property, public health, and safety, or to lessen or avert the threat of a catastrophe in any part of the United States. So that can show up in a number of different ways. Here, we've seen it show up in certain resources that have come to the state. When we think about the process and how this actually occurs, it is all through FEMA. It's all through our federal emergency management agency, that particular department of the federal government. So all requests for a declaration by the president that a major disaster exists has to come from the governor of the affected state. The governor's request is made through the FEMA office. Regionally, state and federal officials conduct a preliminary damage assessment. So they come and look and check things out and see how the state has been affected, and determine if the extent of the disaster and its impact on state resources. And if they say, yes, the impact on state resources is severe enough, the extent of the disaster on people is severe enough, then that declaration, then that federal emergency declaration goes through. When an obviously severe or catastrophic event occurs, the governor's request may be submitted prior to the preliminary damage assessment, and the governor also must certify that the state's resources are overwhelmed. So that is the run through of how these laws, one, define disasters, right? And how within the definition of a legal disaster, the powers of the governor, it's not so much that they change, but it's that, there are a few more things that are able to happen, and it allows for flexibility for things to happen really quickly and efficiently when the crisis itself is also happening very fast and with very broad impact. So in terms of where we are today, another executive order, 2020-96. So maybe type in the chat if you know what 2020-96 stands for, after I just mentioned it in a previous slide. Retail businesses, automotive showrooms, dentists, veterinarians are open by appointment. Office jobs that can't be done remotely are open. We can gather with 10 or fewer people, but the expectation is still that there's social distancing. The expectation is still that if you are in businesses that you are, or public spaces, that you're covering your face with a mask and that you are maintaining your distance. Sit-down services are not allowed to open, which means restaurants, bars, salons, tattoo, nail shop. And the stay-at-home order is now in effect until June 12th. Just to look a little bit at when we talk about emergencies, like a state of emergency, and the kinds of things that our government officials have to take into account when they say, okay, is this catastrophe widespread? Is this catastrophe having a broad impact? Basically, is this event in fact a catastrophe, right? So this is kind of what the impact has been looking like for our state. In April 3rd, there was the largest number of new cases in a single day at 1,953. April 21st, there was the highest number of deaths in one day at 232, and our confirmed cases were above 52,000, total deaths above 5,000. And then looking at Wayne County and Detroit specifically, you've probably read about when they were referring to Detroit as a hotspot. Confirmed cases above 10,000, deaths at 1,200. So you can see that that's, a significant percentage of those total deaths that we saw on April 21st. And if you look at Wayne County broadly, the deaths at 2,284, again, a significant number of those total 5,000 deaths from April 21st. Now these numbers at the bottom are from May 5th. But again, just looking at how those numbers are impacting our region. And then finally, looking at another example of a state of emergency, Executive Order 2020-92. So if you haven't typed in the chat yet, here's another opportunity to tell me what those numbers mean. It declared a state of emergency for Midland County. So, COVID-19 is a state of emergency statewide. The flooding in Midland County is localized to that area. And again, allows for, for example, maybe this is where traffic control will become more important if we think about that list of powers that come from declaring a state of emergency and from these different laws. So, with all of that being said, I am now going to turn this over to Deborah, who's going to lead our Q&A with Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist. And you can hear more about how the things that we've just discussed look in practice, and more about the role of the executive office and the governor and the lieutenant governor. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and hand it over to Deborah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you all being here. Looking forward to talking with our Lieutenant Governor, Garlin Gilchrist. And just so you know, in case you don't know, just a little bit about our Lieutenant Governor. Of course, he's a native Detroiter, University of Michigan grad. He's an engineer. He's a husband and father of 3. And he's our 64th Lieutenant Governor. So with that, we'll get started. And we'll start with a question about you, Lieutenant Governor. what is the role of the lieutenant governor? And specifically during this pandemic, how has that role maybe been altered?
Sure. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Misha. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you to the whole Citizen Detroit team for your leadership and really setting a model and a standard for civic engagement and civic excellence here in the city of Detroit. So the lieutenant governor is how Misha was comparing the governor to the president of the United States as the chief executive for the state. The lieutenant governor is parallel to the vice president. So I work side by side with the governor in processes of decision making and then lawmaking and law execution, all these sorts of about primarily, and that we come together to try to make sure that we have good coverage and that our teams have what they need to respond. So for me, there's been a few sort of key areas that I've really been spending a lot of my energy on. And so I'll talk about those quickly in no particular order. The first has been with respect to education. As Misha alluded to, one of the decisions that we made was to end face-to-face education for kindergarten through 12th grade students. And part of what that has required then is for school districts to put together plans to facilitate learning at a distance, which is a very different model for delivering educational content and instruction. And so one role that I've played in that response has been, how can we facilitate internet access? How can we facilitate access to internet-enabled devices for students across the state of Michigan, where we have a significant number of students, 600,000 to be precise, who don't have an internet-enabled device in their homes. They have access, and kids across internet access at all in their homes. Certainly that internet access that would enable them to stream a video like this, or the type of internet access that you would need to do any kind of learning at a distance. We've been working with school districts to put together learning at a distance plans. We've been working to, and I actually have worked with device manufacturers and internet service providers to provide, to make provision for those devices and internet access so the kids can learn. We've also worked with the federal government to enable some flexibility for districts to be able to spend resources to provide professional development for their education professionals who are now facilitating learning at a distance, perhaps for the first time in their careers. And so I've been involved in that education piece pretty heavily as we think about what education is going to look like going forward. The second piece has been supporting small businesses. All of you know that the businesses in our communities are part of what help define the identity for our communities. And certainly that is true. It seems like that's more true the smaller the business. And so I've been working to try to put in place supports both at the state level and also to leverage federal dollars for resources to support our smallest businesses in our community so that they can stay afloat through this challenging time. And it's been really hard. And then minority-owned businesses have been hit particularly hard through this pandemic. And so the state is certainly trying to make our resources as far as we can to support the street programs and really change their practices, whether it's a restaurant switching to delivery or carry out, whether it is a brewery that's switching to make hand sanitizer rather than alcohol, and everything in between. And so certainly trying to support them, help to bring the Paycheck Protection Program here to the state of Michigan, and I'm working to make sure the second round of it is more responsive to the needs of our smallest businesses in our Black communities and minority communities across the state. And so that's something that's really important to me. The third piece is that I am chairing the Michigan Coronavirus Task Force on Racial Disparities. And the pretext for that is the state of Michigan, first of all, has the most diverse leadership team of any state in the country when it comes to how this response is being managed. So you have Governor Gretchen Whitmer, a white woman, myself, a Black man. We have Dr. Jonae Caldoun, who was the state's chief medical executive, a Black woman. And so it's not coincidental that our state was one of the first and remains one of the few that reports its coronavirus test results and COVID-19 deaths along racial and ethnic lines, along their demographic, age, and gender identity. And by making that data, by collecting it, by making that data public, it enabled us to observe this difference in mortality when it comes to communities of color, and particularly the Black community, which we make up 14% of the community statewide, but we make up 40% of the people who passed away. And once we saw that sustained, we knew that we had to have a full-throated statewide response. We're the only state that has stepped up to do so by creating this task force. It's a multidisciplinary one that has medical professionals, epidemiologists, public health experts, has members of the community, faith leaders, parents, young professionals, young people under 18. It has educators from K-12, higher ed, and community college. It has unions represented because so many of the people who have been working this whole time, who we all owe a debt of gratitude, the bus drivers, the grocery store workers, utility workers, police officers, firefighters, EMTs, nurses, nurse assistants, technicians, the administrators who support the medical professionals who are working in our hospitals and urgent care facilities. All these folks are working, and a lot of them are members of labor unions. We wanted to have this perspective in it while they have been working in the context of this pandemic. And so the task force is looking to, one, expose and reduce the mortality rate with this disease in real time, as well as connect to our broader work on addressing health disparities along racial lines, as well as other disparities along racial lines, educational outcomes, as well as socioeconomic opportunity. And so some of the things that we've been looking at as a task force is how can we ensure that for people who need to get tested, that they can get tested. Testing is the front door to treatment. And because, frankly, when you talk about that sort of difference between what's the federal government responsibility and what state government responsibility is, having a strategy for getting testing capacity to every state in the country is by definition a federal function when it comes to the response to this global pandemic. But we did not have a national strategy. And so our state was left scrambling like others to try to develop a testing capacity and a supply chain for testing components. And so unfortunately, it took some time to do that. But what that meant is there were people who wanted to get tested, but who couldn't because we didn't have enough tests. And unfortunately, because people had to make cases, but who got tested and who didn't due to that limited constraint, there was a lot of, frankly, bias that entered into those decision makers, those doctors, those professionals. And so one of the first actions of the task force was to recognize that bias and name that for every medical professional in the state, because that's what research shows is how you deal with bias, by naming it so people can be responsive to it. We try to take other measures to make sure that people who are low income can isolate safely, to develop a testing model that will allow us to drive tests to people rather than having people have to come out to get tested, and reducing the requirements. You don't have to have a doctor's note or a prescription to get tested anymore, for the most part in the state of Michigan. So these are some of the things that have been important in our overall response to some of the roles that I've been playing as Lieutenant Governor.
Wow, that is a lot. So really appreciate that. So it's good to know. And it's also good to know that these are things you're involved with beyond of the pandemic: education, businesses, and the task force for racial disparity. So the next time people need to know what a lieutenant governor does, you did an excellent job on letting us know. Thank you. Our next question is, during the presentation, we talked about the governor having issued several executive orders, as well as calling upon the president for federal emergency powers. Tell us why and how the governor decided to use those powers.
Well, we had something that we needed to respond to quickly. And I think that, when you have thousands of people getting sick a day and hundreds or if not more dying on a daily basis, I think that's the definition of an emergency. And so we looked at what our legal authority was based on those laws that Misha outlined and described, and determined that we had the authority to utilize those laws to take the action we thought was necessary to carry out what is our primary responsibility as public servants, which is to protect and promote public health and public safety. And so in the context of the pandemic, utilizing that authority, we have taken these actions, and we believe that we have done the work, and in partnership with the people of the state of Michigan overall, all 10 million of us, for the most of the 10 million of us, have done what we needed to do to try to slow down the loss of life due to this virus that is present in our state, that we do not have an antiviral treatment for, that we do not have a vaccine. And while the loss has been on level, I've lost 21 people to COVID-19. This is real for so many of us, and there can't be There's very few people in the state who have not been touched by this directly or know someone's been touched by it directly. But we've acted in ways that we believed that we could protect vulnerable populations, whether it was being the first state in the country to test everybody in our prison system, whether it was putting in place a directive to direct judges to release people from jail because they're safer at home than they are in jail, developing a strategy for driving tests in nursing homes and homeless shelters and things like that. These are actions that we had to take and that we believed helped to save people by following the public health experts. And we're blessed in the state of Michigan to have some of the best public health experts in the world working with us and helping guide our response to this. So, but that's why we've taken the action that we need to take. And we think that there have been significantly more lives saved than otherwise would have been without that.
Okay, great. And just briefly, something that I know we're interested in is, how do you and the governor work with local municipalities?
Yeah, it's critical. And then I think, this pandemic has shown the importance of the partnership with state and local governments. And FIU been dealing with a second emergency, frankly, in the last week, and that was the once in 500-year flooding in Midland County area in mid-Michigan. And that was another example of the state government working with local governments in terms of coordination. So the State Emergency Operations Center has counterparts in every county that are sort of emergency operations centers that we work with. We also work with the elected and appointed leadership in counties, whether it's a mayor or city manager, to make sure that they have what they need from the state government as far as resources, but also that they're communicating what they're seeing on the ground. And a lot of times, some of the suggestions for the executive actions that we've taken at the state level have bubbled up from requests from local governments. So that's been the case, whether it's from the city of Detroit or other parts of the state.
All right, Lieutenant Governor, were there any other comments you wanted to add?
I just want to, again, thank everybody for being engaged. I think what frankly gives me the ability to be a good public servant and a responsive one is people who are active and engaged like yourselves and asking questions and sharing ideas. So certainly, please continue to use the training that you are of your participation in choice activities. It's something that really helps. I think all of those who call themselves public servants and who have to be public servants, it helps us be more responsive. And one more thing is, during this pandemic, remember to check on your people. The irony of everything that we're doing in the social distancing is that it reminds us of how much we need each other, how connected we truly are. And while we have these structures in place, whether it's government structures, whether it's public health infrastructure, all of them rely upon our people. And our people being confident that they can be healthy when they leave their homes and when they interact with one another. And so I know that on the other side of this, we're going to value one another. We're going to check in on one another more regularly. We're going to say, I love you more forcefully. We're going to value our in-person time. And I think we're actually going to be closer together. And that is something that we need to carry forward as we govern together, live together, and work together. So I'll just remember that as we come through this and as we go forward.
Well, thank you. And we recognize that you have another event you have to go to, and we appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And we're going to take some questions from the audience relative to the presentation. But thank you, and I'll be seeing you around the quad. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor. I don't know if people have questions for the presentation, regarding the presentation, because we were informed that the Lieutenant Governor does have another engagement. So unfortunately, we won't be able to do Q&A with him. You can provide us questions, which we will get to his office and make sure that we post those answers in our various social media. But for now, if you do have questions for Citizen Detroit, it can look to see if people have their hands raised or if there are any questions in the chat. So,
what do you think local civic engagement may look like in the fall and or ahead of the August election, taking into account, I'm reading this exactly as the person wrote it, so I want to make sure I honor their words. Taking into account economic and food insecurity affecting folks' time and energy to get out the vote and mobilize, and the potential for a second wave of COVID, which actually, I mean, I know this is something we've been talking about a lot as a team, so I'm wondering, Sheila, if you have any thoughts that you want to share up front about that question.
Thank you, Misha. Yeah, I think we're thinking about this a lot at Citizen Detroit. one of the things we've got to take into consideration potentially is going back to some really old school grassroots neighborhood civic engagement, community organizing. Maybe it's time to bring sound cars back to go through the neighborhoods, but reminding people, to fill out your census form right now, and closer to the elections to mail in your ballots. Maybe we need to figure out if we can set up get a little platform and do it over the summer, socially distant neighborhood, like a town square meeting on an issue with everybody 6 feet apart to talk about an issue. Maybe got to start using the texting capacity that we all have to share information. I mean, being physically distant cannot destroy certainly not in this city, with the tradition of civic engagement and community engagement and grassroots organizing. We will find a way around it. Lots of parades happen now to celebrate, young people's graduations. Maybe we need to have some parades reminding people to turn out to vote, because if your vote needs to be heard. So we're looking at those kinds of strategies. All things being equal, it would be really good to be able to have a campaign in the fall to make sure that people have mailed in their ballots, because I do think mail-in ballots are going to be critical to full engagement. So I think there are tools, old-fashioned telephone trees with FaceTime. Who knows what an interesting FaceTime strategy you could get going and maybe for some people who haven't used these tools to begin to get comfortable with them, could be one of the few good parts to this particular experience. But I think the Lieutenant Governor made the really important point that civic engagement is really essential for public servants to know that they're staying connected to the people they took the oath to serve, and that they're listening to the voices of the community. So we're going to keep working on it. So any suggestions you have, please share with us. This is uncharted waters and new terrain for all of us. So we're gonna come up with some interesting strategies, I think.
Yeah, I think I would also add, because the question also was mentioning about how the stress of the moment, whether you're facing economic insecurity or food insecurity, that can take away from your capacity to do some things that you maybe had planned originally. And so I think it's just important to remember that civic engagement happens at many different levels and has lots of different forms. And so, like Sheila said, if you're mass texting about the census, that counts, that matters, that helps, right? And if you have more capacity, our government is still moving, and there are still opportunities to get involved, like the redistricting commission. Applications to be on the redistricting commission are due in a week. And you can do it all on michiganredistricting.gov, free notary and all. Submit your application. There are lots of organizations that are still doing work, boards that are still meeting, commissions that are still meeting. So if you have a little more capacity and you want to get involved in that way, those opportunities are still there.
Okay, Heather, let's see.
I'm new to learning about your organization and appreciate your presentation. Found it really informative. And as somebody new to learning about your organization and with the topic of civic engagement, can you talk a little bit about what, if anything, you all are doing with civic engagement having to do with getting awareness out about things with people who are incarcerated, with truth in sentencing, and trying to spread some of that information that's pertinent related both to COVID now, but also with voting and things that are coming up? Are you doing anything with that?
Well, just so you know, our main goal is to inform and engage residents. And when it comes to criminal justice, that's actually one of the things that our participants have told us they have interest in. Since you are new to Citizen Detroit, one of our mainstays is what we call dinner and dialogues, which we don't know when we'll do again because of COVID, but those are very large meetings of about 300 where we gather and we discuss factual information for people to get them engaged so they can indeed act on different things. And we have hands-on exercises. Like Sheila Cockrell mentioned, we're looking at different ways to engage during COVID, not just for criminal injustice, but for the census, as well as getting the vote out, because we usually also have big events with all of the candidates. We're looking forward to possibly having them put all the candidates have their videos on our website, which we've done in the past. And lots of people have gone to our websites to look at the candidate videos. So in terms of how we're going to do all this with COVID and post-COVID, I can't address that, but maybe Sheila or Misha can add something to what I just said. But it's a very good question, and I'm really glad that you joined us and you're interested in what it is that we do.
Yeah, I think the issue of people who are incarcerated and COVID-19 really puts in sharp relief some of the structural issues that have been there for generations. I mean, a prison sentence should not be a death sentence under any circumstance. I know that behind the scenes, we've provided some assistance to the teams that have filed both the lawsuits in both Oakland and Wayne County, demanding that there be better provision for the safety of the people being held. And we got to remember that in a county jail like that, the majority of people are there simply because they can't pay bail. So one of the issues that when we can figure out what the new normal is, would be to have a whole session on the relationship of the bail bond system to the unnecessary incarceration of people prior to any kind of legal proceeding. So it's a really critical issue. It's been around here a long time. Actually, I'm old enough to have been involved with the filing of the original lawsuit against the Wayne County Jail. So I'm aging myself a great deal, because we're talking 1972, when Justin Ravitz and others filed the first lawsuit that declared the place to be not serving the interest or protecting the rights and needs of people there. So it's a really important issue and one that I'd like to do more with.
Yep. So Heather, thank you so much for joining us and being here today. We really appreciate seeing you and welcome. I would just add that to Deborah's point, prior to shelter in place, we had started doing research on cash bail issues, and then we had to reorganize. During election years, we spend a lot of time preparing on getting folks educated on the candidates and making sure that they're prepared to vote based on their values and belief systems. And so we try to connect folks with those candidates, which is where those videos come in place, because normally you would have an opportunity to ask them about these specific issues if you were with us. So we're trying to figure out how to adjust in that way. But we will be inviting all judges to submit videos to our informdetroit.org platform, which is where we put all our candidate videos. We've had great participation from judges in the past, which I think increases that thoughtfulness about our criminal justice system and the places in which we do have voice. And then finally, in all of our voter awareness, we also are trying to remind people constantly that folks you have the right to vote if you have a felony. You have a right to vote if you're awaiting trial. If you know someone who's awaiting trial, they have the right to vote. Make sure people know that information. It's so important. There's so many people who don't vote thinking that they don't have the right to. And the only time you can't vote is if you are serving a sentence currently. So that's a really important part of our messaging as well.
You did this was an excellent presentation. I hope you're a teacher because as many young people.
A school board member.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, you've got to just, yeah, people need exposure to you. You did a beautiful presentation. And anyway, thanks for reminding me that, I got a note saying I'm unmuted or something. Okay. Anyway, thanks for reminding us that the redistricting, what do you call it? The committee, or that you have to apply by next week, because I'd forgotten that deadline was coming up. I've been working with people. In fact, I was close to people who did all the canvassing and everything for getting, the anti-gerrymandering law passed. So I'm excited and really hope a lot of people apply for that commission, and that we have a balance of diversity on that commission, because we need points of view. We need a broad group. And I can't apply because I'm a district or a precinct delegate, and that's against the rules, you know. So there are a lot of people who, even if you aren't yet fully engaged, if you are interested in becoming engaged, there will be lots of opportunities to educate yourselves, you know. So please apply, and any people who you know who have strong feelings about this, get them to apply, because we really need a strong group of people on that committee.
Thank you very much. That's really important point you're making.
Yes, thank you.
And so far, I think I heard that the majority of people who have applied so far are white men.
From Oakland County.
From Oakland County, okay.
Mhm.
Okay, well, anyway, let's keep getting those applications in. And it doesn't hurt to apply, even if you don't feel like you're ready for the committee.
Right.
You will get ready quickly if you get on this committee. So, you know, so just muster all your energy to do it, or get the right people. You know, if you have friends who are more, you think will be better at it, all of you apply. You know, it doesn't hurt. So,
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Very good information. That is one of the things we were going to remind people. So thank you, Misha, for reminding people about that. And it can all be done online, including the notary, at michiganredistricting.org or .gov. 'Cause I don't have a slide in front of me.
.org. I said .gov by mistake. Strike that.
Okay.
Don't remember that. .org.
Okay.
Redistrictingmichigan.org.
Okay.
And again, totally free to apply. You can do it all online. It's random selection to select to the committee. And you just you can't be holding a partisan position. So when Astra mentioned she can't file because of being a precinct delegate, it's because that is a partisan position, connected, like affiliated with a political party. So if you're holding office in one of those kinds of roles, or you have in the last 5 years, you can't apply. But you can learn all about that actually on our YouTube channel, because we just posted a video that has our session on redistricting that we just did a couple weeks ago now. And we actually invited redistricting commissioners from California who experienced a similar process, not the same, but a similar process. And they talked about their experiences. So that video is up on our YouTube channel right now.
Mhm.
And we also want to remind everybody to complete the census.
Yeah.
So if you haven't, please do. Remind your neighbors, your family, your friends, your coworkers, anybody to complete the census. It's less than 10 questions, less than 10 minutes. You can do it online. You can do it via the phone in several different languages. You can do it by mail. And once fall comes and it's post-COVID, census takers will eventually be coming door to door. So there's no excuse. We need everybody to be counted. That's where our money comes from. It also makes a difference in terms of the number of legislature in houses that we have. So that's very important. So please make sure you complete the census. Also, don't forget to vote in both the primary and the general election. Registration, again, very easy for you with the law that passed on the ballot last year, the proposal, I'm sorry. So our Secretary of State actually has sent out absentee applications for everybody. So you can actually do absentee. You don't need a reason to vote absentee. You can opt out when you go to Secretary of State once they become open. You can always register to vote, but you don't have to. You can register up to and including the day of election, and a few weeks prior to, there's in-person absentee voting. So lots of different ways to vote in the state of Michigan, and it's very important that your voice is heard. And we'll provide as much information as we can so you are indeed an informed voter. So make sure that you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, all of our social media. If you're visiting us today, then we have your contact information. So you'll also be getting our newsletters every Wednesday. Every other Wednesday, they're in-depth newsletters that talk about one subject in a lot of detail. The other weeks, we give you information on various things as well as updates. We throw in some trivia every now and then. We also spotlight a citizen who's done some cool stuff in the community. So make sure that you check that out when that comes out, or you can see it on our website. You can also sign up for texting. I don't have the slide in front of me, don't want to give the wrong number, but I think it's 484848. Oh, good. And if you text to Citizen Detroit to that number, you'll receive our text updates as well. So lots of different ways to communicate with us, keep informed us, ask us questions, and be involved with Citizen Detroit. So I don't know if Misha or Sheila have any closing words, but I do want to, again, I know the Lieutenant Governor's gone, but really appreciate his canned answers, appreciate the presentation, all the hard work from the entire Citizen Detroit team. Appreciate you all being here. And we'll see if there are any other comments from Misha or our CEO, Sheila Cockrell.
Just if you have questions for the Lieutenant Governor that you weren't able to get answered today, email them to us, and we will make sure that he has the opportunity to respond. And then in our follow-up emails, you know, when we do these sessions, we like to follow up with additional resources to everyone who attended. So we'll be able to send you the answers to those questions as well as post them on our social media. You can email to info@citizendetroit.org.
Just like to say good night to everyone and thank you for joining us this evening. And be safe and take good care. And as the Lieutenant Governor said, we have to stay connected with each other. That's what makes it all worthwhile.
Okay. Good night.
Good
Keep
night.
washing those hands.
Yes.